joining me now, Janine Perrott and Troy Bramston. Thanks, both of you. We, as I mentioned at the start of the program, expecting more turbulence and violence in Hong Kong later today. Before we get into the specifics of that unrest, I want to ask you about Dan Tehan and his response to these four Liberals. Janine, four Liberals expressing worry about the influence of the Chinese Communist Party on our campuses. Dan Tehan says he gets it, he's working with Vice-Chancellors. What do you think of that?
Well, I think he's saying exactly the right things. This has taken a long time to filter through, which goes to the heart of what your discussion was about, the incredible amount of money that Australian universities are reaping and the fact they wanted to turn a blind eye. Dan Tehan's done things like crack down on cheating in universities, which is also an issue with foreign students, as we know, everywhere, but that was seen as being quite tough. So I think, as I said, this is coming a bit too late. We've seen stories in the Nine press about the influence that Chinese students are having on student politics, their growing influence there. Now, that's fine if they're learning democracy, but as we hear, if they're not, if they're representatives of China and they're having an impact here, we have to be careful. We're seeing it on the streets of Melbourne and Sydney, the impact. So I think he's making the right noises, but at the end of the day, the government can only do so much. They have to call on the universities that are just blinded by greed and do not want to do anything to upset the business model they've created.
And Troy, it's in their interest to listen and to deal with it, isn't it? Because for a couple of reasons, not the least of which their own credibility, but for the sustainability of this industry.
Yeah, that's right, Kieran. I was actually not all that surprised that Liberal Senator Amanda Stoker said that universities lack leadership on this issue and other issues. We've seen in recent years universities becoming increasingly dependent to an extent on foreign money. So, you know, Chinese-backed institutes and think tanks and funding coming in that way, and also an increasing number of Chinese students on campuses as well. But, you know, that doesn't buy influence in how universities should be run in terms of influence over students, over academics, over what is being taught. So I think there is a case for universities exerting their leadership capacity, their influence and their authority over how their campuses are actually being run. I think that's an important issue. And the other thing I'd make a point about, Kieran, is I'm worried about the culture on our campuses as well. If there's an increasing number of Chinese students who pledge allegiance to the Chinese Communist Party and they're using that to somehow argue the case for the Chinese government on campuses and trying to downplay any sort of opposition or criticism to that regime among other students, that's also worrying as well.
It's interesting Dan Tehan remains positive, though, Janine, about the cross-cultural elements that I discussed with him in the context of, you know, things like the Colombo plan and so on with international students. 30% of our international students, an enormous number, come from China, but 70% from other nations as well. He's still quite positive in terms of that cultural impact, and I guess that's a bottom line different to the other bottom line that we've been referencing, $35 billion a year.
Yeah, and it's a really good point, Kieran, because the debate becomes foreign students become code for Chinese students because of their outsized influence. And this is an area where the universities themselves can highlight it, that they temper the Chinese influence while perhaps raising and pointing out the other foreign students we have from many other countries and the benefits of it. As I said, it's skewed too much to China, but that's because of the influence they're exerting outside their numbers.
The Hong Kong protests, we've had a statement from the Chinese ambassador here in Canberra overnight, Troy, in which he points to the violence, the need to restore some law and order there. He says as well, a prosperous and stable Hong Kong serves the interests of the international community, including Australia. We sincerely hope that the people from all walks of life in Australia will see the real picture of the situation in Hong Kong, act in the interests of Hong Kong's prosperity, stability and the rule of law. So Ambassador Chen Jingye is saying he wants Australia to get what's happening there. Do you think we've got a good sense of what's happening there? Is it time for those protesters to cool it?
Well, I'm worried about the fate of these protesters. I mean, of course, me, like I guess others around Australia, sympathise with what they're calling for, which of course started about this extradition treaty, but has since metastasised into a much bigger one about democratic and political freedom. And I sympathise with what they're trying to do, but I'm worried that if they do push it too far, we could end up with a Tiananmen Square type situation, of course, which happened 20 years ago. So that is a bit of a worry. And, you know, there must be some sort of process here for some kind of negotiation, some sort of compromise, some sort of, you know, give and take, I guess, on both sides here, because we can all see where this is going. And we can see those armoured vehicles, those troops massing on the border, and we can all see down the time tunnel as to where this might end up. And so that is very, very concerning. The other point to make, Kieran, with these protests, you know, in Australian capital cities is it's quite extraordinary because this is now spilling over internationally. And what we're seeing is these Chinese nationals in Australia using the opportunity to protest to protest here in defence of the Chinese authoritarian regime, which of course they can't do in China. So this is most extraordinary, and now there's a suggestion in some of the reports that those who are pro-Hong Kong, if I can use that term, are now being targeted by pro-China protesters themselves. So there's concerns now whether this will now spread beyond China and into other countries as well, because there is a very large Chinese diaspora around the world.
I think it's a good point, Troy, in the sense that these protesters, while we absolutely sympathise with their cause and their right to freedom of assembly and so on, that it does create that fear, doesn't it, Janine, that there'll be a crackdown. I guess one of the things that's in a way surprising is that it's taken so long under this one nation, two systems approach, because Hong Kong is so different in terms of being that commercial centre, former British province that has, you know, to the mainland. It has so many different cultural elements and values to the mainland.
Yeah, look, I mean, I completely support what they're doing. As a business reporter, I know the importance of Hong Kong, both to the West and to China. However, let us just be clear here. They lost the argument 22 years ago when the British handed it back. It's always going to go back to China. Yes, they've made promises. Wow, you know, an authoritarian regime is an authoritarian regime. I am sure the people of China and the rest of the world would like to see it stay as it is. But practically, that ain't going to happen. It is moving that way. Now, all they're doing is probably bringing that day closer. I'm not sure what you can do. This is not an independent country. We know it's part of China. Now, I am not putting the Chinese view there at all. But I also have pointed out, I think China has a lot at stake here. People talk about this as a financial centre for the West. It is also crucial to China. They put a lot of money through there. They have a lot of companies listed there. I think the reason it's gone that long, this isn't like Tiananmen Square, an internal issue. I think they will be hoping it can be resolved beforehand. They have a lot to lose here too. The thing is, to me, the turning point was this week with the airport sit-in. If they had continued that, I think they would have pushed it. And the fact that they walked out, they cannot get back in to stop transport, to me indicates the protests can continue, but it got to dangerous levels there. And I think, as you say, they need to mediate, but they've got to work out what they want, because they ain't going back to where it was pre-97. So I think they've got to work out their demands on that.
Absolutely, Janine, and I 100% agree with you on that, that element of the fact that this is not Tiananmen. I guess the other reason that is, Troy, well, we hope it's not anyway, because China's got so much at stake here in the context of, well, there's 100,000 Australian expats that live there. There are tens of thousands of British and other internationals. So it's not like Beijing of 1989. They can't have a brutal military crackdown and then not expect to have dozens of other internationals who get caught up in that.
Well, I think that's right, and the world, the eyes of the world are on China right now. Now, there's no doubt there would be some hardliners in the Chinese Communist Party who would be thinking they can do what they did 30 years ago in Tiananmen Square. There's no doubt that would be percolating through the Chinese government and the Chinese Communist Party. But as I say, the eyes of the world are on China right now, and I don't think that the world would look at all favourably on any kind of crackdown that involved widespread violence and death and carnage like what happened in 1989. It's interesting to know that, you know, a lot of countries around the world put their relationship with China into a deep freeze after the Tiananmen Square massacre. And of course, Bob Hawke, who was a very close friend of China, he didn't go back to China, and there was no significant country-to-country government relations for the rest of his prime ministership, which went on for a few more years. So, the eyes of the world are on China right now, and they need to think very carefully about what the international reaction would be if their response to these protesters are too heavy-handed.
Can I just pick up something there? Sorry, Kieran, just on what Troy said. Yes, that is the case, but remember in 1989, this was a very different situation on the Chinese economy. They weren't our major trading partner. They weren't the biggest, second biggest world trade. They have become far more integrated. There are a lot more countries that depend on it. And when you look at some of the weak arguments that countries, even like Australia, don't mention human rights within China, it will be a very interesting situation to see where those dependent, terribly dependent on China economically, how far they could go on this.
Yeah, indeed. And in the context as well of this ongoing trade war with the United States, how could there be a resolution to that if we were to see, and of course it would be broadcast, as Troy said, Janine, the eyes of the world are on China, but even more so than in the past, because every phone is a gateway to the world as well in terms of the images. If this were to see violence, I just don't see how there could be any resolution to the trade war, for example, if they were to... as you say, an authoritarian regime. It's not something I don't think they would have considered, but if they do follow that path, I think it'd have devastating consequences for China as well economically, Janine.
Yeah, but you're looking at this trade war as though it's being run by rational people. This is a trade war that's been created in the US by a president who seems to flip-flop from day to day, depending how it's going to affect his poll numbers. Now, this trade war has been, and I'm not saying that a lot of things he's doing shouldn't have been called out, including, and Australia should note, banning the influence of Chinese students into high-tech and sensitive areas in research. There are a lot of things he's done that are good, but in the end, this is a trade war he has created. He escalates weekly in his tweets, and it's only when it affects the stock market, which, as Paul Kelly said before, is going to impact on his re-election, that it goes up and down. So the power to stop the trade war or cool it down is within the power, I would think, at the moment, of the president, who, depending what day it is, can do it. Yes, it's a complication, Hong Kong, but I don't really think we can see Donald Trump reacting to that. He took a long time to even comment on Hong Kong, and, you know, it was kumbaya, let's all get together, it'll be fine.
Yeah, human rights not a big motivator, it seems, for his thinking on these matters. But Troy, on what Janine touched on and Paul Kelly mentioned earlier, I don't think it got as much attention as otherwise would have in this week of market turbulence. But Donald Trump blinked when he put a hold or a pause on the next round of tariffs.
Well, I think he did, Kieran, absolutely, because he's looking at that 2020 election coming up sooner than he would like. And the US economy, you know, is gyrating and going through some ups and downs, and there's a lot of economists out of the US now saying that there's a good chance that the US will be in a recession by the time of the next presidential election. So he's got that in the back of his mind, and if anything, he is a politician. But remember, during the 2016 campaign, he campaigned against China. He said he was going to be tough on China. He was the great deal maker. He could get a better outcome for the American workers, for American businesses, and he hasn't really been able to do that. I mean, there's been some things that he's done, but there have been consequences for a lot of his actions. And when you put tariffs on imported goods, that means that people in America are paying more for things than they were previously. So I'm not sure that he's created too many new jobs. I'm not sure that he's helped too many businesses, and now we're seeing the fallout of this trade war. So, excuse me. So there must be some kind of bilateral talks, and there's suggestion that that's going to happen sooner rather than later. But there's also an opportunity here for perhaps the IMF or the World Bank or the WTO to play some kind of role here as well, because the rest of the world has an interest in what's going on between America and China.